All right, let's unpack this. Imagine you're trying to get a real data-driven picture of a sprawling research field.
Hmm.
You want to know who's making waves, what are the big ideas bubbling up, and, where are things headed next?
Yeah, the big picture.
Exactly. Your first thought might be to dive into endless papers, but there's a shortcut, a powerful tool called Bibliometrics.
Right.
It's like a scientific magnifying glass, letting us zoom in on the patterns and trends of scholarly communication. But here's the kicker.
There's always a catch.
There is. Just like any powerful tool, you need to know how to use it properly, and maybe even more importantly, how to critically assess someone else's use of it before you rely on their insights.
That's absolutely crucial.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into an absolutely fascinating paper, Evaluating Bibliometrics Reviews, a practical guide for peer review and critical reading by An-Duk Hong,
Yeah.
published just this year, April 2025.
Very timely piece.
Very. Now, this isn't just for academics in ivory towers. This is for you if you want to quickly get truly well-informed, if you need to sift through vast amounts of information, and if you want to spot those crucial insights that genuinely matter. It's about understanding the underlying structure of a field, not just, what's on the surface.
And what's truly fascinating here, I think, is that bibliometrics, while it's incredibly powerful for understanding scholarly output, has grown so complex.
Right.
I mean, the methods, the tools, it's a lot.
Yeah.
And this complexity means we desperately need clear, robust frameworks to assess its quality, its reliability, and, well, ultimately its trustworthiness.
Makes sense.
So this paper really steps into that gap. It offers systematic guidelines, not just for those meticulously conducting these studies, but for readers like you trying to make sense of the results. It's really about building confidence in the insights you're seeing.
So our mission today is clear. We want to equip you, our listener, with the tools to critically evaluate bibliometric research, to understand its incredible strengths,
Which are many.
recognize its crucial limitations,
Also important.
and ultimately extract the most important nuggets of knowledge and strategic insights from these kinds of studies. Think of this deep dive as your shortcut to becoming a truly savvy reader of academic trends.
Helping you sort the signal from the noise, essentially.
Exactly. Helping you discern what's genuinely impactful from what's just presented as such. Hashtag 1, what is bibliometrics and why does it matter? So to start us off, maybe the basics. What exactly are we talking about when we say bibliometrics? It sounds a bit technical.
It does sound technical, but the core idea is pretty straightforward. At its heart, bibliometrics is a sophisticated data crunching method.
Okay.
It applies statistical and mathematical techniques to systematically analyze academic outputs. Publications, basically.
So instead of just reading paper after paper.
Right. You're looking at the whole landscape. It helps us see the bigger picture, patterns, trends, and the measurable impact of scholarly publications.
Impact like citations.
Citations, yes, but also productivity, collaboration networks, lots of things. Imagine using vast amounts of data to literally map the intellectual structure of various fields.
Map it out.
Yeah, map it. Assess research performance, and sometimes even hint at where things might be going next. It's about making those invisible structures of knowledge visible.
And this isn't some newfangled thing that just popped up with big data, is it? I get the sense it has a history.
Oh, absolutely. It has a surprisingly rich history. Its roots go deep, actually back to library science.
Which makes sense. Organizing information.
Exactly. Think of pioneers like Price back in 1965. He started discussing the intricate networks of scientific papers, envisioning how they connected and influenced each other.
Wow, back then.
Yeah. Then a few years later, Pritchard, in '69, formally defined bibliometrics, applying stats to metadata of books and other media.
Okay.
And then you had early giants like Alfred Laska and Samuel Bradford. They laid down foundational laws, we'll probably talk about those later, that still guide how we systematically collect and analyze this kind of data today.
Foundational laws. Interesting.
And then the person who really pushed it forward was Eugene Garfield. He introduced citation analysis and impact factors as key methods. He truly transformed how we measure academic impact beyond just counting publications.
Okay, so it has this history. But here's where it gets really interesting for me. How has this field evolved in the digital age? It feels like the internet and computing power must have absolutely supercharged this whole discipline.
Oh, without a doubt. In truly revolutionary ways, we've seen profound methodological advancements.
Like what?
Well, for instance, integrating natural language processing techniques. This vastly enhances our ability to do sophisticated keyword extraction, topic modeling.
So understanding the actual content better.
In a way, yes.
Hmm.
Analyzing themes and trends in a much more complex, nuanced way than before. And at the same time, network science has revolutionized how we visualize collaboration and knowledge flows.
The mapping part again.
Exactly. It offers completely new insights into how research communities form, how knowledge spreads. You can literally see these academic ecosystems.
Yeah.
And beyond the methods, the practical accessibility has just exploded.
How so?
Well, the rise of massive bibliographic databases, think Scopus, Web of Science,
Right, the big ones.
coupled with remarkably user-friendly yet powerful tools like VO's Viewer and SiteSpace. These have really democratized access.
So more people can do this kind of analysis now.
Exactly. Researchers can now manage, process, and analyze truly vast amounts of data. This lets them systematically examine, say, the conceptual structure, the key ideas, or the intellectual structure, the foundational works, and even the social structure, like collaboration networks.
Right.
It's a massive leap from, manual card catalogs to these dynamic, interactive maps of knowledge.
So beyond just counting citations, which I think is what many people associate with the term, how is bibliometrics actually being used today across different fields? Why should you, our listener, even care about this? What's the real-world relevance?
Great question. Its utility has really expanded incredibly. It's become a tool for strategic insight.
Strategic insight, how?
Well, in medical research, for example, it's actively used to identify emerging therapeutic approaches. It helps track how basic science translates into clinical applications.
Okay, practical.
Very. Environmental scientists use bibliometric mapping to trace the evolution of concepts like sustainability or to pinpoint cross-disciplinary solutions for climate challenges. Even social scientists employ these methods. They use it to understand how academic research influences policy development or catalyzes social change.
So it connects research to the real world.
Well, it can help show those connections, yes. This broad adoption across so many diverse disciplines really underscores its immense utility. It helps navigate these incredibly complex scientific landscapes and make sense of broad, often multidisciplinary research fields.
So it's not just an academic exercise.
No, not anymore. It's really becoming a vital navigation tool for understanding knowledge itself.
Okay, so it sounds incredibly powerful, especially with all these digital age advancements. But what's the catch? Why do we need a practical guide for evaluation like this Huang paper? What could possibly go wrong with something so, data-driven? It almost sounds infallible.
That's an excellent question, and it's precisely the issue the Home paper tackles head-on. Despite its ability to offer these seemingly objective, data-driven insights, bibliometrics' inherent complexity, it can be profoundly challenging.
Challenging how?
While challenging both for the people conducting the studies and for those trying to interpret them. Think about the sheer diversity of data sources.
Like choosing Web of Science versus Scopus versus Google Scholar.
Exactly. Each has its own coverage, its own biases. Then you have the array of analytical tools, each with distinct algorithms, and then all the different ways to visualize the data.
Right.
All of this contributes to a real risk of misinterpretation. If these studies aren't assessed properly, if their limitations aren't really understood,
You could draw the wrong conclusions.
easily. You could get incorrect conclusions about research impact or quality or emerging trends. That's why a guide is so necessary. It's not usually about the data itself being flawed, but more about how it's selected, handled, and interpreted.
So this paper isn't just telling us how to do bibliometrics, but more critically, how to check if it's done well, and therefore, if we should actually trust its findings.
Precisely.
So what are its unique contributions? What makes this paper a big deal?
Well, the Home paper makes, I'd say, 3 key contributions that really push the field forward in terms of evaluation rigor.
Okay, what are they?
First, it provides a comprehensive, systematic evaluation framework. It goes way beyond just looking at the traditional basic metrics. It really embraces the nuances of newer analytical approaches, making sure you get a holistic assessment.
Okay.
Second, and this is a truly crucial innovation, I think, it introduces the VALOR framework.
VALOR.
That's right, VALOR. It stands for verification, alignment, logging, overview, and reproducibility.
Catchy acronym.
It is, and this framework is specifically designed for evaluating studies that use multiple data sources and tools.
Ah, that seems increasingly common.
It is. It's a critical and growing area as more studies try to combine databases for better coverage. So VALOR tackles that specific challenge.
And the third contribution?
Third, it offers very practical, really actionable guidelines for effectively integrating performance analysis, the numbers part, with science mapping evaluation, the structure part.
Bring them together.
Exactly. Providing concrete guidance for assessing how well a study synthesizes these complementary approaches. It helps you see the whole integrated picture.
Okay, so for academic reviewers, the value is clear. But what's the dual purpose of this deep dive for us, the readers, the everyday consumers of these kinds of studies? How does it empower us?
That's a great way to put it. For readers like you, it serves multiple practical purposes. Well, firstly, it teaches you how to critically evaluate the methodology. Look at the specific data sources used, the analytical techniques chosen. This allows you to interpret the findings much more confidently.
So spot potential issues.
Yes.
Yeah.
Secondly, it offers invaluable guidance on identifying what constitutes a truly meaningful research trend, helping you distinguish between, say, just temporary fluctuations in publications versus genuinely substantial shifts in research focus.
Signal versus noise again.
Exactly. And thirdly, it demonstrates how you can effectively leverage these bibliometric insights to inform your own work.
Oh.
Whether it's understanding existing research gaps in your field, mapping out the intellectual structure, the key players, the collaboration structures, or even developing more effective strategies in your own field or organization.
So it's practical knowledge.
Very practical. Ultimately, it equips you to avoid the common pitfalls in interpreting this kind of complex data. It makes you a savvier consumer of this information. Tag 3. The foundational building blocks.
Okay, before we really jump into the how-to of evaluating these studies, maybe let's touch briefly on some of the fundamental ideas that underpin bibliometric analysis and science mapping.
Good idea.
It feels like understanding the physics behind the machine helps appreciate how it works and where its limits might be.
Absolutely. Understanding these theoretical underpinnings makes the whole evaluation process much more intuitive. Tag 3.1. Foundations of science mapping. So, science mapping. It builds on a few key foundational theories.
Okay.
There's the seminal idea of cognitive structure representation through citation analysis. This was first proposed by Small back in 1973.
Cognitive structure.
Yeah, the theory suggests that citations are much more than just references. They act like intellectual fingerprints that connect ideas. They encapsulate key scientific concepts.
So citations tell a story about ideas.
In a way, yes. And this concept combines beautifully with the theory of intellectual proximity.
Intellectual proximity.
Yeah, articulated by Newcomb in 1962 and then refined through work on things like bibliographic coupling.
Bibliographic coupling? What's that?
Think of it like this. If two different newer papers both cite the exact same set of older foundational papers,
Okay.
they're probably discussing very similar ideas, right? They share intellectual roots. That's bibliographic coupling. It shows their intellectual closeness. And this theory posits that scientific knowledge kind of organizes itself into these conceptual spaces where similar ideas and related works naturally cluster together.
Okay.
This is precisely why patterns of co-citation, that's where two papers are frequently cited together by other papers, and bibliographic coupling are so effective at revealing the hidden intellectual organization of scientific fields.
But science isn't static, right? It's always moving, evolving, sometimes drastically changing. Yeah. How do these maps capture that dynamism?
Exactly, that's crucial. The dynamic aspect draws from, well, partly from the powerful theory of scientific revolutions, famously put forth by Thomas Kuhn in 1962.
Paradigm shifts.
Paradigm shifts, exactly. And also from modern network science theories, like scale-free networks described by Barabasi and Bonobo.
Scale-free networks.
Yeah, this helps us understand why scientific citation networks often show unique patterns, like power law distributions. Meaning a few papers or authors act like academic superstars. They get most of the citations, most of the connections, while many, many others have far fewer.
The rich get richer, sort of?
Sort of, yeah. It also explains how scientific knowledge progresses sometimes through gradual accumulation, step by step, and sometimes through these dramatic paradigm shifts.
Okay.
So it's really about understanding how these different mapping techniques, whether they're based on citations, co-authorship, keywords, how they synthesize all these networks to represent the incredibly complex, evolving landscape of research. Tag 3.2, overview of bibliometrics approaches.
Okay, so given those foundations, what are the main practical ways bibliometrics actually measures and evaluates things? What are the main approaches we actually see in these studies?
Right, the practical side. There are two key overarching dimensions to bibliometric analysis that the home paper highlights really well: performance analysis and science mapping.
Performance and mapping.
Yep. They serve distinct but complementary purposes.
Okay, let's start with performance analysis. What's that about?
Performance analysis is pretty much what it sounds like. It focuses on quantifiable aspects of productivity and impact.
The numbers.
The numbers, exactly. Measuring things like the sheer number of publications an author or institution produces, or the total citation counts a paper or journal accumulates.
Oh,
Its primary goal is to assess the output and influence the measurable performance of researchers, specific journals, or entire institutions. It's about answering how much and how often is it cited or used.
okay, that's performance analysis. What about science mapping?
Science mapping shifts the focus. It aimed to uncover the structural relationships within a research domain.
The connections.
The connections, yes. It uses sophisticated clustering techniques to reveal three crucial structures.
Three. Okay.
One, the conceptual structure. This highlights the key themes and ideas within a field. What are people talking about? Two, the intellectual structure. This identifies the most influential works and authors that form the field's foundational knowledge. Whose shoulders are they standing on?
Okay, the influences.
And three, the social structure. This maps out the intricate patterns of collaboration among researchers, affiliations, even countries. Who's working with whom?
Got it. So it's about answering how are things connected?
Precisely. How are ideas, papers, and people connected? And to break it down even further, the paper has a really helpful summary table for the Shoesness. Here are some common methods you'll see within each dimension. For performance analysis, you'll often see things like source analysis, trying to find the most impactful journals or conference series, using methods like finding the most cited sources or applying something called Bradford's ranking, author analysis, finding the most impactful authors, institutions, or countries, looking at who's producing the most or getting cited the most, document analysis, looking at individual articles or overall trends, assessing global versus local citations, tracking keyword frequency over time.
Right, the counting and ranking part.
Yeah, largely, yes. And then for science mapping methods, the ones that visualize the connections. Conceptual structure analysis. This identifies research focuses and trends, often using co-occurrence networks of keywords or thematic maps. Intellectual structure analysis. This helps understand knowledge flow and research gaps, often done through co-citation networks or historiographs, which show historical development. Social structure analysis. This determines collaboration patterns, visualizing networks of authors, institutions, and countries working together.
Wow, okay. So lots of different angles. Hashtag 3.3. Essential bibliometric laws. Now, you mentioned foundational laws earlier. Beyond these general approaches, are there specific laws that sort of govern how information behaves in academic fields, like fundamental principles we should know about?
Absolutely. There are three really fundamental laws that have guided bibliometric analysis since its early days, and they still inform how we interpret data today. They're quite fascinating.
Okay, what are they?
First, we have Lotka's Law. This was developed way back in 1926.
Lotka's Law.
Yep. It describes scientific productivity, and essentially, it suggests a highly unequal distribution.
Unequal how?
A small number of authors dominate research output. They produce the vast majority of publications in a field, while many, many authors contribute just one or two papers.
Sort of like the Pareto principle, 80-20 rule.
Exactly like that, but for academic papers. So what this really tells you is that not everyone is equally productive, and it's a mark of a sophisticated analysis if a study actually acknowledges this inherent imbalance, rather than just presenting a flat ranking where everyone seems comparable.
Okay, that's Lotka's Law on productivity. What's next?
Second is Bradford's Law from 1934. This one addresses journal coverage.
Bradford's Law, okay.
It describes the exponential decay in journal yield on a given subject.
Exponential decay, meaning?
It means that for any specific topic, a relatively small number of core journals will contribute most of the relevant articles. Then there's a second zone of journals contributing fewer articles each, and a third zone with many, many journals contributing only one or two articles each.
Ah, okay. A few key journals, then lots of less relevant ones.
Pretty much. So if a study claims to be comprehensive about a topic, you should look for how they've ensured they've captured enough of those core journals. It's vital for selecting sources appropriately. Not every journal is equally important for a given topic.
Okay, Lotka for authors, Bradford for journals. What's the third one?
And third, Zipf's Law. This originally came from linguistics, studying word frequency.
Zipf's Law.
Yep. But it's widely applied in bibliometrics. It describes the relationship between keyword frequency and their rank.
How does that work?
Essentially, it states that in any body of text or here, in a collection of research papers, a few terms or keywords will be incredibly common, while many, many other terms will be quite rare.
Makes sense.
So in bibliometrics, it helps us understand the distribution of research topics. It shows how a few keywords or themes are very prominent, while many others are much less frequent, more niche. So again, not every topic is equally prominent, and a good study will account for this distribution by identifying key themes or trends. And what's important is that even in our digital age, these classical laws continue to profoundly inform modern bibliometric analysis.
It's still relevant.
Absolutely. So when you're evaluating a study, look for how the authors acknowledge these distributions. For instance, in an author performance analysis, does the study acknowledge Lotka's distribution instead of just presenting a flat ranking? When discussing source selection, do they reflect an understanding of Bradford's zones? And does the keyword analysis consider Zipfian distributions when identifying themes, which shows a deeper understanding?
Okay, so we have these foundations, these laws, these approaches, but let's talk practicalities. What are the real upsides and downsides of this whole approach? Every tool, no matter how sharp, has its quirks and limitations, right? Hashtag 4.1, strengths and limitations of bibliometric analysis.
That's a crucial point. No method is perfect, and really getting a handle on the inherent strengths and limitations of bibliometric analysis is paramount for any critical reader.
Yeah.
Let's start with the strengths, because they are considerable.
Okay, the good stuff first.
Right. Firstly, it handles large data sets with remarkable efficiency. Unlike, say, traditional literature review where reading hundreds of papers becomes overwhelming.
Yeah, impossible sometimes.
Bibliometrics can process tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of publications. It gives you that broader, macro-level view of a field's development and structure that you just can't get otherwise.
Okay, scale's a big advantage. What else?
Secondly, the visualization tools. The advent and continuous improvement of powerful visualization tools have been a total game changer.
Like VO's viewer and site space you mentioned?
Exactly. They aren't just for making pretty pictures. They make it significantly easier to identify complex research patterns, spot collaboration networks, track the evolution of themes, things that would be virtually impossible to discern through just reading or manual review.
Seeing the patterns.
Seeing the patterns, yeah.
Yeah.
And thirdly, because it's quantitative, data-driven, bibliometric analysis is generally considered to be more objective than, say, subjective, narrative-based traditional literature reviews.
That's bias.
Potentially, yes.
Hmm?
It relies on measurable data points, which can reduce the potential for researcher bias in deciding what to highlight or what trends to emphasize, though bias can still creep in, as we'll see.
Okay, so scale, visualization, objectivity, sounds good. But, as you hinted, no method is perfect. What are the potential pitfalls, the areas where we need to be cautious as readers?
Right, the limitations are equally important, maybe even more so for critical reading. Understanding them is key.
So what are they?
Well, the biggest one, arguably, is the risk of selection biases. This can creep in at various stages of the process.
Okay, like how?
Well, first, database choice. This is a huge factor. Different bibliographic databases, Web of Science, Scopus, Google Scholar, they all have varying coverage.
In terms of journals or?
Journals, yes, but also disciplines, publication types, time periods, even geographical representation. Web of Science might be stronger in certain core journals. Scopus might have wider coverage, especially non-English language stuff. Google Scholar is the widest, but also the messiest, least controlled.
So the choice of database matters.
Hugely. Authors might justify their choice, and they should, but different databases will potentially lead to different findings. A good study will acknowledge this limitation upfront.
Okay, database choice. What else?
Search string development. Even if authors clearly explain their search terms, their Boolean logic, building those strings still relies heavily on the researcher's subjective understanding of the topic.
If they miss a key term.
Exactly. If a key term is missed or a common synonym isn't included, the entire dataset could be skewed right from the start. Document type selection. There's really no universally agreed standard for whether you should include only journal articles or also conference proceedings, book chapters, theses, reports.
So researchers decide that themselves.
Often, yes. And that decision can significantly impact the breadth and the nature of the data set you end up analyzing.
Right.
And even software preference.
Yeah.
The choice of analysis software can introduce subtle biases. Different tools might use slightly different algorithms or have particular ways they process or visualize data, which can influence the results you see.
Okay, so selection bias is a big one. Any other major limitations?
Another significant one is the risk of oversimplification. Because it's so focused on quantitative data, on the numbers,
Yeah.
it can sometimes oversimplify the richness and complexity of the research landscape. It might miss the implicit know-how, the deeper theoretical nuances, or the really subtle qualitative insights that lie beneath the surface of the papers.
Like looking at a forest just by counting trees?
That's a great analogy. You miss the ecosystem, the interactions, the undergrowth. So the key takeaway for you as a reader is, always pay close attention to the study's stated objectives, yes, but crucially, look at how the authors acknowledge these limitations.
Do they talk about the database choice? The search terms?
Exactly. How do they attempt to overcome these limitations, or at least justify their specific choices? Transparency here is absolutely vital for trustworthiness. If they don't mention limitations, that's a bit of a red flag. Hashtag 4.2. Evaluating research objectives and scope.
Okay, so when we actually pick up a bibliometric paper, what's the very first thing we should scrutinize, even before we get lost in the data visualizations?
The absolute first step before anything else is to scrutinize the paper's stated objectives.
What it aims to do.
Precisely. And those objectives need to be specific, clearly defined, and robust. Their primary focus should really be on quantifiable data interpretation.
What if they have qualitative goals?
Well, qualitative reasoning can certainly support and enrich the findings, add context, but it shouldn't be the main focus of the objectives themselves. If an objective clearly requires deep qualitative insights into the specific content of papers or complex theoretical arguments, it's likely a bit beyond the appropriate scope of a pure bibliometric study.
So the objectives should match the method strengths.
Exactly. And you should also check for consistency throughout the paper. If the objectives state the study will analyze, say, the intellectual structure of a field.
Then the results section better show that analysis.
Right. The findings and discussions should clearly deliver on that promise. There needs to be a direct alignment between what the paper sets out to do and what it actually presents. Hashtag 4.2.1. Data source and time frame coverage.
And what about the data itself, where it comes from, the database choice you mentioned, and over what period? That seems fundamental.
It is absolutely critical. As we discussed, there's this ongoing debate about which database is best: Web of Science, Scopus, Google Scholar.
Is there a right answer?
Not necessarily a single right answer for all cases. Authors can choose whichever database they prefer, but they must clearly justify that choice.
And the justification matters.
Yes, the justification is crucial and should demonstrably align with the research objectives. For instance, if you're studying a very niche, highly interdisciplinary topic, or perhaps non-Western research contributions, maybe Scopus or even Google Scholar might offer broader coverage than Web of Science. That choice needs to be explicitly explained and defended. The time frame also matters immensely.
How so?
Well, many bibliometric papers use very long time frames, maybe going back decades, 50 or 60 years even.
For historical perspective?
Exactly. That's suitable for understanding the historical evolution of a really well-established, broad concept. However, for analyses focusing on a rapidly emerging field or a very niche topic.
Like AI ethics or something cutting edge?
Precisely. A shorter time span, maybe just the last 5 or 10 years, might be far more appropriate. A longer period could actually dilute or obscure the recent most relevant developments.
Yeah, you'd lose the focus.
You could. And also, related to this, you should critically check for the paper's relevance and novelty.
Is it adding something new?
Yeah. Is the study truly adding fresh insight to the field? Or is it maybe just replicating existing reviews on the same topic, perhaps just tacking on an extra year or two to the time span?
We've probably all seen papers like that.
Unfortunately, yes. Authors need to provide a clear rationale explaining their unique contribution, why this review was needed now. Hashtag 4.2.2, data cleaning processes.
Okay, this next part sounds like the less glamorous, but maybe incredibly important bit, making sure the data is actually clean and reliable before you even start analyzing it. How do we evaluate that?
Oh, it's vital. Truly foundational. Get the data cleaning wrong, and everything that follows is built on shaky ground.
So how do we check it?
The PRISMA flow diagram, that stands for Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analyses, is an excellent, widely recognized guide here. Even if they don't use a formal PRISMA diagram, the principles should be clear. You should look for clear answers to specific questions at each stage of the data collection and cleaning process. First, at the identification stage. This is where the initial search happens.
The keywords.
Exactly. What specific keywords and Boolean strings did the authors use? Was the reasoning behind their chosen keywords clear and well justified? Did they think about variations, like using wildcards for truncations, or including both British and American English spellings? Like organization with an S versus a Z.
Those little details matter.
They really do. Then, at the screening stage, This is where they apply filters to weed out irrelevant stuff.
Okay.
What specific filters did they use? Maybe based on titles or abstracts? Were language choices justified, like only including English papers? Were decisions on which document types to include or exclude clearly explained and consistently applied?
Like deciding not to include book reviews, maybe?
Exactly. And then at the eligibility stage,
Yeah.
this is confirming the final set of papers.
How many made the cut?
Right. How many articles were ultimately eliminated from that initial search result? And crucially, why were they eliminated? Did they keep track? And importantly, were any potential limitations stemming from the final dataset scope acknowledged and discussed? Maybe they ended up with fewer papers than expected.
Okay, that covers cleaning at the article level. What about keywords?
Good point. Beyond just cleaning the list of articles, pay close attention to keyword level consistency. This is really important for conceptual mapping.
How so?
Well, did the authors use a thesaurus or some kind of standardization tool to merge synonyms or related terms like collaboration and cooperation or climate change and global warming? Did they reduce ambiguous terms? Did they stick to British or American English consistently?
If they didn't.
If the authors didn't report these meticulous efforts, you should be pretty cautious when interpreting their co-occurrence results, those thematic maps. There might be redundancies or inaccuracies that could really skew the picture of the field's main themes.
So messy keywords lead to messy maps.
Basically, yes. And ideally, for maximum transparency and to truly ensure reproducibility, reviewers, and sometimes readers, if the data is shared, should ideally have access to the raw data repository.
To check it themselves.
To check it, or at least to understand the process fully. Full transparency allows for verification.
Okay, let's circle back to this Valor framework you mentioned earlier. It sounds like a major contribution of the home paper. Why is it needed specifically for studies that pull data from different places or use different tools? Why is that scenario special?
Good question. It's needed precisely because, as we touched on, the landscape of academic databases and analysis tools is diverse, and each piece has its own unique characteristics, its own quirks.
Right, Scopus isn't Web of Science.
Exactly. Different databases have varying journal coverage, different indexing policies, sometimes even different citation counts for the same paper. And similarly, different bibliometric tools, VO's Viewer, CiteSpace, Bibliometrics R package, while all powerful, often employ slightly different algorithms for clustering or mapping.
So mixing and matching can cause problems.
It can, yes. These differences can significantly impact the study's comprehensiveness, the reliability of its metrics, and ultimately lead to different interpretations. If a study does use multiple sources or tools, which can be great for broader coverage, it absolutely must handle the data harmonization and validation with extreme care.
Harmonization, like making sure everything aligns.
Precisely. Making sure the data is comparable and combined correctly. Otherwise, the insights might be robust, or they might just be artifacts of how the data was merged. Valor provides a checklist for doing this carefully.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. Let's break down Valor itself then. You said V-A-L-O-R. What does each letter stand for, and what should we, as critical readers, look for under each component when we see a multi-source study?
All right, let's unpack Valor. It's a brilliantly conceived, really comprehensive framework for quality control and documentation, specifically in these multi-source bibliometric studies. It systematically addresses 5 key aspects. First, verification of data consistency.
Verification.
This is all about ensuring the integrity and comparability of the raw data as it's pulled from different sources. You should check, are the metadata formats consistent across databases? Did they address author name disambiguation, J. Smith versus John Smith versus Jonathan Smith across platforms? That's a common challenge.
I can imagine.
Are institutional affiliations standardized? And critically, did they verify and reconcile citation counts? Because, as I said, counts for the same paper can surprisingly vary between databases. Next, alignment of time periods.
Alignment. Makes sense.
This is crucial for temporal accuracy, especially when merging data. Are the publication periods aligned precisely across all the databases used? How do they handle tricky things like early access articles?
Those papers available online before official publication?
Exactly. They can skew recent data if not handled consistently. A good study using Valor principles will document how they dealt with that, and also look for documentation of the specific search date stamps for each database. When exactly was the data pulled? Then, logging documentation.
Logging. keeping records.
Yes, this is all about transparency and providing sufficient detail for others to understand and maybe replicate the process.
Yeah.
Did the authors meticulously detail their database-specific search strategies for each source? Are the data cleaning protocols for each source clearly explained and justified? Were tool-specific parameter settings documented thoroughly? The choices made within VOS Viewer or site space.
The nitty-gritty details.
The nitty-gritty. And are the data integration procedures, how they actually merge the datasets, transparently described? After L comes O, overview of result validation.
Overview, checking the results.
Right. This component asks whether the results hold up under scrutiny when compared across different analytical angles or data slices. Are key metrics, like the top authors or journals, cross-referenced across the different platforms or datasets used?
So does Scopus agree with Web of Science on the top journal?
Something like that, yes.
Yeah.
And if there are variations, are they explained? Is the network analysis, the mapping, validated across different tools if multiple were used? Do the clusters look similar? And are consistency checks performed for the keyword analyses to ensure the themes seem coherent across sources? And finally, are reproducibility.
Reproducibility, the gold standard.
The gold standard for scientific rigor, absolutely. This is about enabling others to potentially replicate the findings. Ideally, the raw data set should be provided or made accessible somehow. Is there a detailed methodology section describing the steps taken within each tool used? Is a step-by-step data processing workflow available, maybe as supplementary material? And crucially, is the version information for all the software tools clearly stated? Software updates can change algorithms.
Wow, okay. That is thorough. That framework sounds incredibly practical, but also like a lot of work for the researchers.
It is a lot of work. It demands an incredibly detailed, almost forensic approach to data handling and documentation. That's probably the biggest hurdle, the sheer time and meticulousness required.
But the payoff is better quality.
Immense payoff, yes. It significantly enhances the quality and the credibility of these complex multi-source studies. It helps ensure the findings provide genuinely reliable and actionable insights.
And for us as readers,
For you as a reader, especially one looking to quickly get well-informed and extract reliable insights, Valor acts like a quality filter. It's your shortcut to quickly spotting whether a multi-source study is likely trustworthy, or if maybe it's built on somewhat shaky data foundations because they haven't addressed these points.
all right, let's pivot a bit. If science mapping is about drawing the intellectual landscape, performance analysis is where we, as you said, start counting the trees, looking at the numbers. But here's the catch I often feel. Just counting doesn't tell you much, does it? How do we move beyond simple numbers like publication counts or the H-index to really understand their true meaning and significance?
You've hit on a critical point there. It's absolutely about interpretive depth, not just data presentation. Merely showing the numbers, the rankings, the counts isn't enough. We as readers need to assess their relevance, their accuracy, and importantly, the nuanced interpretation provided by the authors.
Otherwise, they're just numbers on a page.
Exactly. Without that context and interpretation, these numbers can be quite misleading or, at best, superficial. Hashtag tag 6.1. Impact of time frames and cutoff dates.
Now, you mentioned timeframes earlier as being important for the overall scope. Does the exact cutoff date for data collection really make a difference, especially when we're looking at performance metrics like publication counts?
Yes, it certainly can. And its impact is particularly acute for studies covering shorter time spans, let's say 5 to 10 years.
Why shorter spans especially?
Well, think about it. Well, a precise cutoff date, say December 31st of the previous year, might seem minor for a study covering 50 years.
Right. One day doesn't change much there.
It becomes critically important for these shorter span analyses. For example, imagine a study reports a sharp decline in publication output for the current year, maybe the year the study was done. But what if their data collection cutoff was early in that year, say April or May?
Ah, so lots of papers haven't even been published or indexed yet.
Precisely. That apparent decline might actually be a completely misleading snapshot. It might even mask what will eventually be an increase for the full year.
So authors need to explain that.
Yes, good studies will. Authors need to provide that additional narrative, that qualitative explanation, to account for these nuances related to data lag and indexing. They shouldn't just let the potentially misleading numbers speak for themselves. And related to this, a really good study, especially one looking at recent trends, will address the subtle but important difference between an article's first online date and its officially indexed date in the database.
What's the difference?
Well, modern journals publish articles online very quickly, sometimes months before they get assigned to a specific volume and issue number, and are formally indexed in databases like Scopus or Web of Science.
Oh.
These early access papers might be included in the database search, but the indexing process itself can take months, sometimes even a year. For short span studies looking at the very latest year or two, this indexing lag can significantly impact the publication counts. Good studies will acknowledge this and ideally address it during their manual review or interpretation phase. Hashtag tag 6P6.2. Publication indexing and citation patterns.
Okay, let's talk about the big ones. Citation counts, the H-index. These are such common terms in academia, used for evaluation all the time. How do we evaluate them properly in a bibliometric study beyond just seeing a big number next to a paper or an author?
Right, these metrics are ubiquitous, but they absolutely should not be evaluated in isolation. A high citation count for a paper, for instance. It can be influenced by many factors other than just inherent quality or groundbreaking nature.
Like what?
Well, like the age of the publication, older papers generally have simply had more time to accumulate citations, or the sheer prominence or impact factor of the journal it was published in. Papers in Nature or Science often get cited more just because of the journal's visibility.
Right, visibility matters.
It does, and this raises another really important question the paper highlights. Is the influence you're seeing global or local?
Global versus local citations, what's the difference?
Global citations would be the total count a paper has received across the entire database, across all of science perhaps.
Yeah.
Local citations refer to the citations a paper has received specifically within the dataset being used for the current study.
Yeah.
So, citations from other papers on that same niche topic.
Ah, okay.
A paper might have a very high global citation count. Maybe it's a methods paper used everywhere. But that doesn't necessarily guarantee it has high influence within the specific niche being studied. It might be foundational, but not central to the current debates in that specific subfield. These distinctions are crucial for accurate interpretation. And here's another critical point for evaluating citations. Different research fields cite papers very differently.
How so?
Well, a paper in, say, molecular biology might rack up hundreds of citations very quickly, whereas a paper in history or philosophy might take decades to get a significant number, and the total might still be much lower, even if it's highly influential within its field.
So comparing raw citation counts across fields is misleading.
Hugely misleading. That's why when you're evaluating citation counts in a bibliometric study, you should look for whether the authors have used normalization techniques.
Normalization, like adjusting the numbers.
Exactly. Normalization means they've adjusted the raw citation counts to account for these field-specific differences, and often also for the age of the publication to make comparisons fairer. There are various methods, like the Mean Normalized Citation Score, MNCS, or percentile ranks, or Source Normalized Impact per Paper, SNIP.
Okay.
If a study hasn't normalized its citation data, especially if it's comparing across different fields or over long time periods, those comparisons can be incredibly unreliable. You should expect authors to clearly justify their choice of normalization method, if they use one, and demonstrate why it's appropriate for their specific research context.
Okay, that makes sense for citations. What about the H-index? That seems like a kind of gold standard for measuring individual researcher impact, doesn't it?
The H-index is useful, yes. It cleverly tries to balance productivity, number of papers, with citation impact, how often they're cited. An author has an H-index of H of their papers have at least H citations each.
Right.
However, it definitely has its limitations. The most well-known one is a significant bias towards senior researchers.
Because they've had more time.
Exactly. They've simply had longer publication histories, more time to publish papers, and for those papers to accumulate citations. So the H-index naturally grows over a career.
So comparing a young researcher's H-index to a senior professor's isn't fair.
Generally not, no. Good studies, the really thoughtful ones, will account for this limitation, especially if they're attempting to compare scholars at different career stages.
How can they do that?
They might use more nuanced metrics. For example, something called article fractionalization, which tries to assign proportional credit to each author on a multi-authored paper. Or they might consider the author's first year of publication within the specific topic being studied to get a sense of their trajectory. These approaches can provide more insightful and fairer comparisons, especially if the goal is to identify truly emerging scholars or rising stars rather than just listing the established names who have been active for decades. Hashtag 6.3. Ranking tables and thresholds.
So bringing this together, what does this all mean when we see those typical top 10 lists in bibliometric papers? You know, the top 10 authors, or the top 10 journals or countries.
Now the ranking tables. This is a classic area where selection bias can subtly creep in, and where interpretation needs to be careful.
How so?
Well, simply picking an arbitrary number like top 10 can be quite unfair and potentially misleading, especially if, say, the 11th and 12th ranked authors or journals have production numbers or citation counts that are very, very similar, maybe almost identical to those ranked 9th or 10th.
Drawing the line at 10 seems artificial then.
It often is. The home paper argues, and I think rightly so, that the most rigorous and fair approach is for the threshold to be dynamic, not fixed. You might select the top 12 or top 8 or top 15 if that's where a natural break or gap occurs in the data distribution, rather than adhering rigidly to a round number just because it sounds neat. And here's another nuanced detail that often gets overlooked in these tables. How are ties broken?
Ties, like if two authors have the same number of publications.
Exactly. If multiple authors or journals share the exact same primary ranking metric, say total publications, then additional secondary metrics like maybe their H-index or total citations or something called the G-index or M-index should ideally be used to differentiate their rankings more meaningfully.
Rather than just listing them alphabetically.
Precisely. Just using alphabetical order to break ties is arbitrary and doesn't reflect any real difference in impact or performance. But really, the most insightful analyses will go beyond just presenting the static ranking list. They'll actively compare rank differences across different metrics.
What do you mean?
For instance, why would an author rank first in total publication output but fall way down, say, to 10th or 11th, when ranked by total citations?
So high quantity, maybe lower average impact?
Could be. Or conversely, why might an author only rank, say, 10th in total production, but climb up to second place when ranked by citations?
Maybe fewer papers, but each one is a blockbuster.
Exactly. These discrepancies, these shifts in rank between different metrics, often reveal fascinating working patterns. They might highlight prolific authors versus authors with a few highly influential papers. These patterns deserve discussion. The same analytical rigor applies when comparing things like single-country production versus multiple-country production for institutions or countries. It tells you about national versus international focus and impact.
Okay, let's shift gears now from performance analysis, the numbers, to the other big dimension, science mapping. This sounds more like trying to draw a picture, a cartography of ideas, showing how knowledge is connected. What are the key elements here, and what should we be looking for as critical readers?
Exactly. Science mapping is all about visualizing the intellectual terrain, the structure of a research field. It primarily uses, as the paper outlines, three main types of analyses to provide a truly comprehensive view of a research domain. We touched on them earlier.
Right, the three structures.
Yes. First, conceptual structure analysis. This identifies the key themes, the core ideas, and the active trends within a field. How? Typically through techniques like analyzing keyword co-occurrence, which keywords appear together frequently, and tracking thematic evolution over time. What are the hot topics? What's fading?
Okay, themes and trends. What's second? Second, intellectual structure analysis. This explores the fundamental relationships between the most influential works and authors in the field. It aims to reveal the foundational knowledge base, the intellectual pillars upon which the field is built, often done through co-citation analysis, which papers get cited together.
So, the history and foundations.
Precisely. And third, social structure analysis. This examines the intricate collaboration networks. It looks at connections among authors, institutions, and countries, highlighting the social dynamics that drive research production and dissemination. Who's working together? Where are the hubs of collaboration? Now, while conceptual structure analysis, understanding the themes, is almost always a must-have in a comprehensive bibliometric review.
Because you need to know what the field is about.
Exactly. But the decision to include the other two, intellectual or social structure analyses, should really be thoughtfully guided by the specific field's maturity and the study's stated objectives.
Why maturity? Well, for a very new, rapidly emerging topic, for instance, a social structure analysis might not be very informative yet. The collaboration networks might still be too sparse or unstable to yield truly significant or reliable insights. It might be too early to map them meaningfully. Hashtags tag 7.1, evaluating conceptual structure analyses.
Okay, let's drill down into that first one then, conceptual structure. We're often looking at keyword co-occurrence networks here, those maps with clusters of related terms. What are the common challenges or pitfalls we should be aware of when evaluating these?
Right, the keyword maps. They can be incredibly insightful, but they also come with challenges. The primary ones often stem from subjectivity in the data preparation and interpretation phases.
Like the keyword cleaning we talked about?
Exactly. There's a significant risk of selection bias due to the initial keyword choice and how rigorously they were standardized or cleaned. And these analyses often tend to overemphasize the most popular high-frequency terms just because they appear more often. This can sometimes obscure important niche topics or genuinely emerging themes that haven't hit high volume yet.
So the biggest clusters aren't always the most interesting.
Not necessarily, no. Also, a limitation is that these analyses often treat terms somewhat statically at a given point in time. This can miss the nuanced conceptual evolution of terms, how the meaning of a keyword might change over time, or potential causal relationships between themes. So, to ensure intellectual depth when you're evaluating a conceptual structure analysis, you should carefully look at a few key aspects.
Okay, what should we check?
First, interrogate the raw material again. Keyword selection and cleaning. How rigorously did they standardize the keywords? Were synonyms and variations merged effectively? What criteria guided their selection of which keywords to use, for example, author keywords versus database index keywords? How did they decide on the thresholds for inclusion? Was it justified?
Right, the data quality.
Second, network visualization. Are the visualizations actually effective? Do the maps represent distinct, clearly interpretable clusters of themes? Or is it just a jumbled mess? How are the labels for each cluster generated and justified? Are they meaningful?
Makes sense.
Third, network density and centrality. How do the authors differentiate between central, core concepts and more peripheral ones? Do they analyze the connections between different clusters? What does that tell us?
The relationships between themes?
Yes. Fourth, if they present a thematic map, often a four-quadrant map showing themes based on centrality and density, did the authors just present the map? Or did they offer a deep contextual interpretation of why certain themes fall into categories like motor themes, important and well-developed, niche themes, specialized, or emerging declining themes? The interpretation is key.
Not just showing the picture, but explaining it.
Exactly. And finally, if they did a thematic evolution analysis over time, were the time slices they chose logical? Did they align with significant developments in the field? Did the authors actually discuss how keywords evolved and shifted between themes, explaining why certain themes might have emerged or declined? That longitudinal perspective adds a lot of value. Hashtag tag 7.2, evaluating intellectual structure analyses.
Okay, moving on to the second tick, intellectual structure. This sounds like it's trying to get to the very roots of a research field, the foundational pillars.
Precisely. It focuses on mapping the relationships between the cited works, the papers, and authors that form the intellectual bedrock of the field.
And how is this typically done?
The common methods here are co-citation analysis.
Which is when two older papers are frequently cited together by newer papers.
Exactly. Identifying clusters of papers or authors that are consistently cited together reveals shared intellectual heritage and structure. The other common method is historiography, or historical direct citation networks.
Historiography.
Yeah, this tries to create a chronological map or representation showing how influential papers have shaped the development of ideas over time, often identifying key turning points or landmark publications.
Okay, so what are the limitations here? What biases should we watch out for when evaluating intellectual structure?
The main limitation stems directly from its reliance on citations themselves. And citations, as we know, can introduce various biases and overfocus on highly cited papers. This might miss the context or importance of less cited but still significant works. Citation time lags. It takes time for papers to get cited, so recent groundbreaking work might appear less influential than it really is in these maps. The issue of self-citation, and sometimes an overemphasis on classic, older publications simply because they've been around longer and had more time to accumulate citations, potentially obscuring more recent chefs.
So, when we're evaluating these co-citation maps or historiographs, what should we specifically consider?
You should consider several points. Citation selection. Was the citation coverage comprehensive across sources and time? How exactly were the influential works identified for inclusion in the analysis? What were the thresholds? Cluster identification. What methods were used to define and validate the intellectual clusters? How are the labels for these clusters determined? Are they justified and meaningful? Do they represent coherent schools of thought, key authors and papers? Do the key authors and foundational papers identified through this intellectual structure analysis align logically with the findings from the performance analysis we discussed earlier? Is there consistency? Historiography. If a historiograph visualization is presented, does it show clear timeframes and actually capture movement or evolution? Did the authors discuss significant turning points? And importantly, did they try to explain why certain influential papers might not appear prominently in the map? Understanding these absences can sometimes be as insightful as understanding the presences. Hashtag tag tag 7.3, evaluating social structure analyses.
And finally, the third type, social structure. This is about the people, right? How researchers, institutions, and countries connect. What insights does this offer and what should we look for?
Exactly. This examines the collaboration networks, typically mapped using co-authorship data from the publications.
Who wrote papers together?
Who wrote papers together, yes. While it's primarily quantitative mapping connections, it offers invaluable insights into the dynamics of collaboration within a field. It allows researchers to identify key players, influential research groups, central institutions, and understand how knowledge is effectively produced and flows through these social networks.
So mapping the who's who and who works with whom.
Pretty much, yes.
Are there limitations to this approach too?
Yes, a key limitation often lies in how the algorithms work. They usually treat each instance of collaboration, each co-authored paper at a given point in time, as a single node or link. This means they might not effectively express the full evolution of collaborative relationships over extended periods. They tend to provide snapshots rather than dynamic trajectories of how collaborations form, persist, or dissolve over time.
Okay, so for us to evaluate the depth and validity of findings from a social structure analysis, what specific things should we look for in the paper?
Here's some key questions to ask. Scope of the network. How diverse is the representation of authors? Does it capture researchers across different types of affiliations, universities, industry, government, and various countries? Or is it heavily skewed? Centrality and connectivity. How are the central authors or institutions identified within the collaboration clusters? What metrics are used, example, degree centrality, between Nelsness centrality, and how are the connections between different clusters analyzed and explained? Or, equally important, is the lack of connection between certain groups discussed?
Why certain groups don't collaborate?
Exactly. That can be very telling. Institutional collaboration. Are the key institutions the big universities or research centers and their specific contributions identified? Are any long-lasting or perhaps newly emerging collaborations highlighted? Are the influential institutions primarily regional hubs, or are they globally connected? Is this context discussed? Country collaboration. How are the regional and global dynamics analyzed? Are the dominant collaborating countries identified? Are emerging players highlighted? Do the authors discuss potential policy implications or geopolitical influences on these collaboration patterns, especially perhaps between developed and emerging economies? That adds another layer of insight.
Okay, this feels like where the real magic might happen. Taking the performance analysis, the numbers, the rankings, and the science, mapping the structures, the connections, and actually putting them together. You mentioned earlier this integration offers deeper insights.
Absolutely. This integration is where the most profound, the most nuanced, and often the most distinct understanding of research dynamics truly emerges. What each type of analysis, performance, or mapping provides valuable insights independently, their synthesis, their combination, allows for the uncovering of complex patterns that would almost certainly be missed when examining each dimension in isolation.
It's like having two different lenses on the same subject.
Exactly. It's the difference between seeing individual trees, counting them, measuring their height, and understanding the entire forest ecosystem, how the trees interact, how the forest is structured, how it's changing. Hashtag tag tag 8.1. Evaluating author impact through multiple lenses. Take author influence, for example. A truly comprehensive evaluation goes far beyond just looking at raw citation counts or even the H-index.
How so?
Well, the Hong paper highlights this beautifully. Consider an author who has a very high number of citations but occupies a relatively peripheral position in the collaboration networks.
So, cited a lot, but doesn't co-author much.
Perhaps. They might have a different kind of influence. Maybe they're a foundational theorist whose work is widely cited, but not actively collaborated upon day to day, compared to someone who is both highly cited and holds a central position in collaborative efforts.
The second person sounds more like a team leader.
Likely, yes. Someone central to active research teams and knowledge dissemination within the current network. And we can see this distinction clearly when we consider different career stages or roles. You might see rising scholars, for instance.
Newer researchers?
Yeah. They might have only moderate citation metrics simply because they're earlier in their careers and haven't had as much time to accumulate citations. But when you look at the social structure maps, you might see them occupying increasingly central positions in the collaboration networks.
Indicating growing leadership.
Exactly. Indicating growing collaborative leadership and integration into the core of the field. Conversely, you might have established researchers whose citation counts remain consistently high due to their past work, yet their centrality in the current collaboration networks might actually diminish as maybe they transition into mentorship roles or focus on less collaborative, more summative work.
So what about those connecting figures? You mentioned bridge authors earlier.
Right. Those are fascinating. What's really interesting here are these bridge authors. These are individuals who might not necessarily top the individual citation rankings at all.
So they wouldn't stand out in performance analysis alone.
Probably not. But when you look at the science maps, particularly the social or sometimes even the conceptual maps, you see they play incredibly crucial roles in connecting different research clusters, or maybe even bridging disparate subdisciplines that don't normally talk to each other.
They facilitate knowledge flow.
Precisely. They are vital conduits for knowledge flow and the cross-pollination of ideas between different parts of the field. Strong, integrated studies should explicitly identify and explain these multifaceted patterns of influence. They show how different forms of impact, citation impact versus collaborative bridging, contribute to a much richer, more comprehensive understanding of how a field develops and innovates. Hashtag tag tag 8.2, cross-validation of research trends.
Can this integration also help us confirm if the trends we think we're seeing like an emerging topic are real and robust and not just some kind of statistical fluke?
Yes, exactly. The integration of performance metrics with science mapping provides an incredible, powerful mechanism for validating and enriching the identification of research trends.
How does that work?
Well, strong analyses will demonstrate clear alignment between the different perspectives. For instance, if the papers identified as highly cited in the performance analysis correspond directly with the major nodes or clusters identified in the co-citation networks, the intellectual structure.
And maybe also represent key themes in the conceptual maps.
Right. If all those signals align, it strongly reinforces the identification of those papers or themes as truly core to the research field. Similarly, if a theme is identified as emerging in the conceptual maps.
You'd expect to see related papers getting more citations recently.
Exactly. Truly emerging themes should show not only growing prominence in the thematic maps over time, but also corresponding increases in publication volume and citation counts in the performance analysis for recent time slices. When these different signals create a coherent, reinforcing picture, you can be much more confident that the identified trend is real and significant. And importantly, the flip side is also informative if studies identify misalignments.
Like a theme is trending in the maps but isn't getting many citations yet.
Precisely. Or maybe a highly cited paper appears surprisingly peripheral in the co-citation networks. If a study finds these discrepancies, they shouldn't just ignore them. Instead, they should offer thoughtful, analytical explanations.
Why might that happen?
All sorts of reasons. Maybe the theme is so new that citations haven't caught up yet. Maybe the highly cited paper is influential in a different field altogether. These apparent contradictions are not necessarily flaws in the analysis. They're often windows into deeper insights about how research trends actually develop, how they propagate, and how they eventually get recognized, or not, by the wider academic community. Exploring these tensions is the mark of a really insightful study. Hashtag tag tag 8.3, Geographic and Institutional Dynamics.
This integrated approach sounds like it could also reveal really interesting global patterns, looking at institutions and countries.
Absolutely. Integrating the performance metrics, like institutional publication counts or country citation impact, with the science mapping networks, like institutional or international collaboration maps, reveals much more complex geographic and institutional patterns that significantly shape how research develops globally.
So more than just ranking countries by output.
Much more. For instance, high-performing institutions, those with many publications and high citation impact, should logically have meaningful positions in the collaboration networks. But the nature of those positions might vary significantly.
How so?
One top university might be a central hub in many domestic collaborations, while another might be highly cited but act more as a bridge connecting to international networks. The integrated view shows these different strategic positions. Similarly, country-level citation metrics gain much deeper meaning when they are interpreted alongside the patterns of international collaboration shown in the social structure maps.
Seeing who collaborates with whom.
Exactly. This integrated view can vividly show how knowledge actually flows across borders, how different national research systems interact or perhaps fail to interact, what barriers or facilitators might exist for international collaboration.
That seems really important for policy.
It is. This is particularly key for understanding things like regional citation disparities. Why do some regions seem to cite each other more or get cited less internationally? It often reflects complex interactions like varying funding levels, language barriers, historical research traditions, or different opportunities for international collaboration. The integrated analysis helps unpack that complexity. Hashtag 8.4. Methodological considerations and potential contradictions.
Okay, so when authors are trying to do this integration, bringing performance and mapping together, what are some final methodological things they need to keep in mind and that we should look out for, especially when dealing with those potential contradictions you mentioned?
Good final check. Methodologically, when integrating these different analyses, maintaining appropriate temporal alignment is crucial. Are they comparing citation data from one period with collaboration data from the same period?
Right, comparing apples to apples time-wise.
Exactly. Authors also need to effectively handle potential variations in granularity between the different metrics and networks. For example, performance might be analyzed at the author level, while collaboration is mapped at the institutional level. How are those different levels connected in the interpretation?
Making sure the scales match up.
Or at least acknowledging the differences. The true robustness of the conclusions drawn from integration hinges on how thoughtfully the study addresses challenges like the inherent time lags between when a paper is published and when it starts accumulating citations, or the variations in collaboration patterns that naturally exist across different research traditions or fields. And we connect this back to the bigger picture and the idea of contradictions. Some of the most valuable insights, the real aha moments, often come precisely from exploring these apparent contradictions between different analyses.
So embrace the weirdness.
In a way, yes. When authors demonstrate, for example, high citation counts for a paper or an author, but that same paper or author appears to have low centrality in the collaboration networks, or when highly cited papers appear surprisingly peripheral in the co-citation networks, these discrepancies are not simply flaws to be brushed aside.
Have clues.
They are windows. Windows into the complex, sometimes messy, social and intellectual structures that genuinely shape academic research. Strong, insightful studies will embrace and explore these contradictions thoughtfully, rather than glossing over them, because they often reveal the most fascinating and challenging aspects of how knowledge is actually produced, disseminated, and valued. Hashtag outro.
Wow. Okay, so what does this all mean for you, our listener? We've covered a huge amount of ground today about evaluating bibliometric research. We went from its historical roots and foundational laws through its strengths and, importantly, its crucial limitations, and all the way to the cutting-edge Valor framework for assessing those complex multi-source studies. It seems really clear that while bibliometrics is an incredibly powerful tool for understanding scholarly communication and academic trends, its true value, the trustworthiness of its insights, depends entirely on how rigorously it's conducted, and just as importantly, how critically it's reviewed and interpreted by people like us.
Indeed. And the increasing sophistication of these methods, while definitely beneficial in many ways, inevitably brings with it significant methodological challenges that we need to be aware of.
Like the database limitations.
Exactly. Data source limitations are a constant consideration. The distinct coverage patterns of Web of Science versus Scopus versus Google Scholar can significantly affect findings, especially if you're looking at emerging fields or research originating from non-Western countries where coverage might be spottier in some databases.
Right.
Citation dynamics also add layers of complexity, things like potential citation inflation in some fields, or just the very different citation behaviors across disciplines. And evaluating truly interdisciplinary research remains a persistent challenge, as traditional discipline-specific methods might inadvertently undervalue the true impact of research that courageously crosses those established boundaries. But ultimately, the real utility and trustworthiness of any bibliometric paper isn't just about the methodology employed, no matter how advanced or sophisticated it sounds. It's profoundly about the critical eye. The critical eye of those who conduct the studies, those who peer review them, and especially those like you who read these studies and attempt to leverage their insights.
We need to be critical consumers.
Exactly. And frameworks like Valor, in particular, offer an incredibly systematic and practical approach to ensuring quality and transparency, which is especially vital for those increasingly common studies that integrate multiple data sources. It helps build that necessary foundation of trust in the findings.
And what's fascinating here, I think, is that the sophisticated principles and the rigorous evaluation framework we've unpacked today, they aren't just confined to bibliometrics alone, are they? As the Hong paper itself points out, this systematic way of thinking about evaluation can be effectively adapted for broader scientometric studies.
That's a great point. Scientometrics is the broader field that looks beyond just publications. It encompasses a wider scope, analyzing things like research funding patterns, the landscape of patent data and innovation, the measurable impact of research on policy documents, or even the dynamics of the scientific workforce itself. The same principles of critical evaluation apply. And looking forward, there's still so much incredible potential for growth and further advancement in this fascinating field. Future advancements could really work towards merging qualitative insights more deeply with the quantitative bibliometric data we've discussed.
Like combining maps with interviews.
Yep, exactly. Imagine integrating bibliometric analysis with expert interviews, or deep case studies, or detailed content analysis of key papers. That could provide a much richer, more holistic understanding of research dynamics and the evolution of complex subjects,
Beyond the numbers.
beyond just the numbers. And of course, machine learning and natural language processing techniques will likely continue to enhance things like keyword extraction and network mapping, maybe facilitating even more precise real-time detection of new trends and subtle thematic shifts almost as they happen. And another really promising avenue, I think, lies in the continuous development and refinement of those field normalized metrics we talked about.
The ones that adjust for disciplinary differences.
Yes. Such advancements are crucial to fairly account for the inherent differences in citation practices and collaboration dynamics that exist across diverse disciplines. They help provide a more accurate and equitable reflection of research impact, ensuring that comparisons of influence across vastly different fields are truly meaningful.
Well, this deep dive really reveals that understanding how to critically assess these kinds of studies, whether they are strictly bibliometric or broader scientometric analyses, is becoming more and more essential in our increasingly data-driven world. So as you, our listener, encounter reports on academic trends or research impact assessments or maps of collaboration networks, remember these insights and the tools for critical evaluation we've discussed today. And maybe here's a final thought for you to mull over. If we consider the increasing complexity and the truly global interconnectedness of the challenges humanity faces today, think climate change, public health crises, sustainable development, how might the rigorous evaluation of bibliometric and scientometric research, applying the kind of critical framework outlined in this paper, actively shape our future collaborative efforts? How can it help ensure that the most truly impactful knowledge genuinely guides policy and practice effectively on a global scale?